It was a gray, biting afternoon on December 11th, 1941, when the fate of the 20th century shifted on its axis. In the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, the temporary home of the German Reichstag, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating weight of history. Adolf Hitler, the master of Europe, ascended the podium to deliver a speech that would ultimately sign the death warrant of his own regime. The Wehrmacht was already freezing in the sub-zero hell of the Russian winter, their advance on Moscow stalled by snow and Soviet blood. The British Empire remained stubbornly unbroken in the West. And yet, with a voice rising in a practiced hypnotic crescendo, Hitler chose this moment of peril to hurl a declaration of war across the Atlantic Ocean, challenging the United States of America. To the silent, uniformed deputies in the hall, and to the historians who would later sift through the ashes of the Third Reich, this decision appeared as the height of strategic madness. Why would a nation, already fighting a two-front war against colossal empires, voluntarily invite the world's largest industrial power into the conflict? The answer did not lie in the logic of maps, nor in the statistics of steel production. It lay in the dark, twisted landscape of Hitler's own imagination. For nearly 2 decades, the Führer had nurtured a profound and fatal delusion, a hallucination so vivid that it overrode all military intelligence. It was the unshakable belief that the United States was a hollow giant, a nation so racially mixed, socially fractured, and spiritually decayed that it would crumble into dust at the first touch of a disciplined Aryan fist. To understand this catastrophic miscalculation, one must travel back long before the thunder of cannons to the silence of a prison cell in Landsberg in the mid-1920s. Here, a younger, imprisoned Hitler dictated his manifesto, Mein Kampf, and later his unpublished second book. In the solitude of his confinement, he constructed a mental image of America that was less a country and more a biological cautionary tale. For Hitler, history was not a struggle of classes or nations, but a brutal, eternal war of races. Blood was destiny. A nation's strength was not measured by its gold reserves, its skyscrapers, or its battleships, but solely by the purity of its genetic stock and the unity of its Volk. Through this distorted lens, the United States presented a picture that filled him with visceral horror. He looked across the ocean and saw the melting pot, a concept that was an anathema to National Socialist ideology. To a man obsessed with the preservation of bloodlines, the idea of blending different ethnicities into a single citizenry was a sin against nature itself. He believed that such a mixture inevitably led to the loss of a nation's survival instinct. In his view, a mongrelized people lost their connection to the soil and their capacity for high culture. They became erratic, weak-willed, and fundamentally incapable of the sacrifice required for total war. In the late nights at the Reich Chancellery, long after the official business of state was concluded, Hitler would often hold court with his inner circle, sipping tea and engaging in long, rambling monologues known as the table talk. In these sessions, his contempt for America spilled out unchecked. He would describe the American people as having the appearance of a mankind that has gone to the dogs. He theorized that the proximity of white Americans to African Americans and the influence of Jewish immigrants had caused a biological and cultural rot that had eaten out the core of the nation. He believed that the United States was a society held together only by the pursuit of the dollar, a fragile glue that would dissolve the moment the heat of conflict was applied. This racial disgust was compounded by a profound cultural elitism. The Nazis viewed themselves as the guardians of Kultur, a concept representing deep, spiritual, organic heritage rooted in centuries of history. They contrasted this with Zivilisation, which they defined as the superficial, mechanical, and soulless material progress represented by the West. To Hitler, America was the ultimate expression of Zivilisation. It was a land of shiny surfaces and empty interiors. He mocked their architecture, viewing the skyscraper not as a marvel of engineering, but as a monstrosity of greed, a concrete tombstone for a people who had lost their connection to the earth. The Nazi hierarchy looked at the vibrant, chaotic explosion of American popular culture and saw only degeneracy. They were particularly obsessed with the phenomenon of jazz. To Hitler and his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, the syncopated rhythms and improvisational spirit of jazz were not artistic innovations, but jungle noise. They labeled it Entartete Musik, degenerate music, and viewed its popularity among white American youth as proof that the U.S. was undergoing a process of Vernegerung, or Negroization. They believed that a society that danced to the drums of Africa had surrendered its soul to primitivism. Similarly, Hollywood was viewed with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. While Hitler privately enjoyed watching American films, he was reportedly fond of King Kong and Gone with the Wind for their spectacle. He publicly denounced the American film industry as a tool of Jewish propaganda. He believed that Hollywood was designed to spread liberalism, feminism, and moral corruption. The Nazi press frequently pointed to the American obsession with beauty contests, makeup, and consumer goods as evidence that the American male had been feminized. In Hitler's mind, a nation of men who cared about the brand of their cigarettes or the cut of their suits could never stand against the Spartan discipline of the SS. This perception of decay was seemingly confirmed by the Great Depression. When the American stock market crashed in 1929 and the breadlines stretched around the blocks of New York and Chicago, Hitler nodded in grim satisfaction. To him, this was not a cyclical economic downturn common to capitalism. It was the final, fatal failure of the democratic system. He contrasted the struggling, unemployed masses of America with the marching, singing columns of the Hitler Youth and the labor service in Germany. He saw the strikes and social turbulence of the 1930s not as the messy vitality of a free society, but as the prelude to a Bolshevik revolution. He was convinced that the United States was on the verge of total social collapse, a house of cards waiting for a stiff breeze to knock it over. His assessment of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was equally poisoned by his prejudices. Hitler despised FDR, viewing him not as a rival statesman, but as a puppet of a global conspiracy. In the Nazi worldview, the United States was a Jewish plutocracy, a state ruled by a shadowy cabal of Jewish bankers and media moguls. Hitler believed that Roosevelt was merely the frontman for this cabal. Nazi propaganda frequently focused on the president's physical disability, his polio, presenting it as an outward manifestation of inner mental and spiritual weakness. They referred to him as a cripple and frequently used the slur Rosenfeld to imply a hidden Jewish ancestry. Hitler convinced himself that a leader who could not walk could never lead a nation to victory, and that a country that elected such a man had lost its warrior spirit.
There was, however, a brief period where Hitler held a flicker of hope for America, centered around the figure of Henry Ford. In the 1920s, a portrait of the American auto magnate hung in Hitler's office in Munich. He admired Ford not just for the efficiency of the assembly line, but because Ford was a notorious anti-Semite who had published The International Jew. Hitler had fantasized that men like Ford represented the true Germanic America that would eventually rise up and overthrow the Jewish plutocracy in Washington. But as the 1930s wore on and Ford's political influence waned in the face of the New Deal, Hitler concluded that the good America had been defeated. The racial stock that produced men like Ford had, in his view, been submerged by the waves of scum from the East Coast. This disappointment only hardened his resolve that the U.S. was beyond saving. This tapestry of delusions led to a massive intelligence failure regarding the American military. Hitler acknowledged the sheer size of the North American continent, but he dismissed its industrial potential with a wave of his hand. He believed that the mongrelized workforce of the U.S. was incapable of the high-precision engineering required for modern warfare. He assumed that a factory staffed by different races, speaking different languages, and unionized by agitators could never match the output of the disciplined German worker. When his advisors tentatively placed reports on his desk showing American plans to build 50,000 aircraft a year, Hitler scoffed. He called the figures propaganda bluffs, famously remarking that the Americans knew only to make refrigerators and razor blades, not fighter engines. The 1936 Berlin Olympics had offered a stark warning that Hitler refused to heed. The Games were intended to be a global showcase of Aryan superiority. Instead, the narrative was hijacked by the breathtaking speed of Jesse Owens, a black athlete from Alabama who won 4 gold medals. For the world, it was a triumph of human spirit. For Hitler, it was a source of intense annoyance. He refused to see Owens's victory as proof of black capability. Instead, he rationalized it through his racial lens, arguing that people whose ancestors came from the jungle had a primitive physique that gave them an unfair advantage over civilized whites. He privately stated that it was shameful for the Americans to let black men compete, reinforcing his view that the U.S. had no racial pride. He saw Owens not as a threat, but as proof that America was relying on colonial subject peoples to fight its battles because its white population had become too soft. As the war clouds gathered, Hitler relied on the advice of sycophants who fed his biases. Colin Ross, a German travel writer who had spent time in America, became one of Hitler's favorite experts on the subject. Ross wrote a book titled Unser Amerika, Our America, in which he argued that the U.S. was a tired, soulless place ripe for a German cultural takeover. He told Hitler exactly what he wanted to hear, that the isolationist movement in the U.S. was not a political preference, but a sign of cowardice. This misinterpretation of American isolationism was critical. Hitler looked at the America First rallies and the fiery debates in Congress and saw a nation paralyzed by fear. He did not understand the nature of democratic debate. He viewed the noise of democracy as the death rattle of a civilization. He could not grasp that in the American tradition, a reluctance to go to war often masked a terrible, grim resolve once the decision was finally made. He assumed that the loud anti-war voices represented the majority, and that even if Roosevelt wanted war, the fractured society would not support him. And so when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler felt a rush of euphoria. He believed that by declaring war, he would unleash his U-boats to strangle the Atlantic supply lines, while Japan would keep the U.S. occupied in the Pacific for years. He theorized that the American public, pampered by soft living and consumer goods, would not tolerate the hardships of a long conflict. He expected them to panic at the first sight of blood. He famously referred to American soldiers as cowboys and rowdies, amateurs who might be able to drive a car but lacked the discipline to stand in a line of fire.
The awakening was rude, violent, and absolute. The hollow giant proved to be made of solid steel. The decayed society mobilized with a speed and unity that terrified the German generals, if not the Führer himself. The racial theories crumbled before the reality of logistics. The mongrelized workforce that Hitler had despised accomplished the greatest industrial miracle in history. From the auto plants of Detroit, which ceased making cars and started making tanks, to the shipyards of California that churned out Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, the U.S. economy roared to life. The Jewish plutocracy proved capable of organizing a command economy that outproduced the entire Axis combined. The cultural critique collapsed on the battlefield. Hitler had expected the American GI to be a mercenary with no loyalty to his cause. Instead, the Wehrmacht encountered a soldier who was pragmatic, resourceful, and backed by overwhelming firepower. The Americans did not fight like the knights of old, which Hitler romanticized. They fought a modern industrial war. They used artillery and air power to level grid squares, valuing the lives of their men over the glory of the charge. To Hitler, this was unfair and cowardly. In reality, it was the methodical application of superior power. By 1943 and 1944, as the skies over Germany turned black with thousands of American bombers, the delusion became harder to maintain for everyone except Hitler. The razor blade makers had built the B-17 Flying Fortress and the P-51 Mustang, aircraft that swept the Luftwaffe from the sky. The corrupt cities of America were untouched, while the ancient cities of the Reich, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, were reduced to piles of brick and ash. The psychological shock of this material superiority was devastating to the German people, who had been promised that the Americans were weaklings. Yet, in the final months of the war, huddled in the damp claustrophobia of the Führerbunker, Hitler clung to the shreds of his theory. He railed against the unnatural coalition of capitalism and Bolshevism that was crushing him. He authorized the creation of the werewolf guerrilla units, fantasizing that the Americans were too soft to handle an insurgency. He believed that if the German people showed enough fanaticism, the spiritually empty Americans would lose their nerve and retreat. He was wrong until the very end. The Americans did not panic. They efficiently suppressed the resistance, fed the starving population, and began the process of rebuilding. The ultimate refutation of Hitler's worldview came not just in the defeat of his armies, but in the aftermath. He had predicted that a Jewish victory would result in the looting and destruction of Germany. Instead, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into restoring Europe. The tragedy of the Hollow Giant narrative was that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom for the Nazi regime. Hitler's hatred of America was a projection of his own rigid, brittle mind. He could not comprehend a strength that was not authoritarian. He could not understand that diversity could be a source of dynamism rather than weakness, that political dissent could coexist with patriotism, and that a free people could fight with a ferocity that matched any indoctrinated fanatic. In the end, the nation he had dismissed as a decaying corpse, a land of jungle music and Jewish bankers, proved to be the most vital and destructive force the Third Reich had ever encountered. The irony was total and devastating. The very traits Hitler had mocked, the mixing of cultures, the commercial drive, the democratic chaos, were the engines that powered the tank treads rolling over the swastika. The decayed republic stood tall amidst the ruins, while the thousand-year Reich, based on the lie of racial superiority, was buried beneath the rubble of its own arrogance.